I was standing right outside my son's luxury condo in downtown Seattle, holding a certified check for $1.5 million. It was meant to be the ultimate gift, the down payment for his absolute dream home. But as I reached for the handle, the door was sitting slightly ajar. I heard my daughter-in-law's voice hissing from inside, and her words made my blood run cold. She was planning to lock me away in a dementia facility the very next morning and drain my entire life savings. My own son was in on it. Before I tell you how a clueless old man turned their perfect trap into their absolute nightmare. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who severely underestimated your worth. My name is Richard. I am 70 years old, and for the last 4 decades I have bled for my family. I did not inherit a single dime. I built my logistics empire from the ground up, starting with nothing but blistered hands and 40-hour weeks on the freezing rain-soaked shipping docks of Seattle. I remember the days when my late wife Diane and I would sit at our tiny kitchen table counting pennies, dreaming of a day when our only child Jason would never have to know the kind of bone-deep exhaustion we felt. When Diane passed away 5 years ago, a massive piece of my soul died with her. I threw myself into my work, expanding the company until it was valued at over $80 million. But all that wealth felt entirely hollow without Diane there to share it. Jason became my entire world. He was my blood, my legacy, the only piece of Diane I had left. I wanted to give him the universe. That is exactly why I was standing in the immaculate, temperature-controlled hallway of his high-rise building that Tuesday afternoon. I was holding a crisp, freshly printed cashier's check. $1.5 million. It was a staggering amount of money, but Jason had been talking for months about this incredible estate in Medina. He said he and his wife Rachel needed the space to start a family. I wanted to be the father who made that dream a reality. I wanted to see the pure joy on his face. I stepped off the elevator and walked down the quiet carpeted hallway with a smile on my face. As I approached their door, I noticed it was unlatched, cracked open just an inch. I raised my knuckle to knock, ready to surprise them with the best news of their lives. But then I heard Rachel. Her voice was not the sweet, doting tone she always used when I came over for Sunday dinners. It was sharp, venomous, and dripping with absolute contempt. She was pacing the living room. I could hear her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. "You make sure the old man signs the medical proxy the exact second he hands over the check," she hissed. "Do not let him leave this apartment until his signature is on that paper." I froze. My fist hovered just an inch from the wood. I stopped breathing entirely. "Dr. Evans is standing by to sign the dementia evaluation tomorrow morning." Rachel continued, her voice growing increasingly agitated. "I already picked out his room at the Sunny Pines facility. I paid the deposit. I cannot stand his boomer lectures for one more day, Jason. If I have to listen to another story about how hard he worked on the docks, I am going to lose my mind. Get the proxy signed, take the money, and let the doctors lock him away." The silence that followed her words felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I waited for my son to defend me. I waited for the boy. I raised the boy whose skinned knees I bandaged, the boy whose tuition I paid, to tell his wife she was out of her mind. I waited for him to shut down this horrific, evil plan and defend his father. Instead, Jason's voice drifted through the open crack, cold, calm, and utterly devoid of emotion. "Relax, Rachel," he said. "Dad trusts me blindly. He thinks I am the perfect son. We get him a glass of scotch, we put the papers in front of him, and we tell him it is just standard tax forms for the house money. He will sign without even reading it. By tomorrow night, he will be locked in Sunny Pines, and his entire $80 million estate is ours." I cannot adequately describe the physical sensation of having your heart broken by your own flesh and blood. It was not a sharp pain. It was a cold, suffocating void that swallowed me whole. My knees felt weak. My lungs forgot how to pull in oxygen. I leaned back against the cool hallway wall, clutching the $1.5 million check to my chest. They did not just want my money. They wanted to steal my freedom, my autonomy, my sanity. They had found a corrupt doctor willing to declare me mentally incompetent. They were going to throw me into a facility and leave me to rot, treating me like a disposable burden just so they could live in luxury. In that brief, agonizing moment, the father in me died. The man who wanted nothing more than to spoil his son, the man who grieved his late wife and wanted to protect her memory, simply ceased to exist. But nature abhors a vacuum. As the initial shock began to recede, something else rushed in to take its place. 40 years of surviving in the cutthroat logistics industry had not made me soft. I did not build an $80 million empire by being a clueless, gullible old man. I built it by reading the room, outsmarting my competitors, and never letting my enemies know what I was thinking. My son had completely forgotten who he was dealing with. My grief over Diane had made me quiet, but it had absolutely not made me weak. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to kick that door off its hinges. I wanted to march in there, throw the check in their faces, and scream until my voice gave out. I wanted to confront them with their own monstrous greed, but I stopped myself. Anger is a very poor strategist. If I confronted them now, they would simply deny it, cover their tracks, and find another covert way to destroy me behind my back. I needed to be smarter. I needed to be utterly ruthless. I carefully folded the certified check and tucked it deep into the inner pocket of my wool coat. I rolled my shoulders back, stood up straight, and forced my breathing to slow down. I practiced my warm, oblivious, loving father smile until it felt perfectly natural on my face. I reached out and pressed the doorbell, preparing to deliver the performance of a lifetime. The game had just begun. The chime of the doorbell echoed through the heavy oak door. It took less than 10 seconds for the brass handle to turn, but standing there, waiting, felt like an absolute eternity. I forced the muscles in my face to soften, molding my features into the warm, oblivious expression of a proud, simple father. The door swung open, and there stood Rachel. Her face instantly shifted into a mask of sweet, doting affection. It was a terrifying, flawless transformation. Less than 2 minutes ago, her voice had been dripping with absolute venom, wishing me locked away in a dementia ward. Now her eyes sparkled with feigned delight. "Richard," she beamed, stepping forward to wrap her arms around my neck in a tight embrace. "We are so happy you are here. Jason was just saying how much he was looking forward to seeing you this afternoon." I patted her back, feeling the coldness of her silk blouse against my palms. I stepped inside the immaculate condo. The air smelled of expensive vanilla diffusers and polished leather. It was a space I had practically paid for, entirely a stepping stone to the $2 million Medina estate they were supposedly buying tomorrow. Jason walked out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on a linen towel. He gave me a wide, boyish smile, the exact same smile he used to give his mother Diane whenever he wanted something expensive. "Dad," Jason said, crossing the room to shake my hand firmly. "It is so good to see you. Please take a seat. Let me pour you a drink to celebrate." I walked over to the velvet sofa and sat down carefully, resting my leather briefcase on my lap. Inside that briefcase was the certified check for $1.5 million. My life's work, 30 years of sweat and sacrifice distilled into a single slip of paper. Jason moved to the wet bar, the clinking of crystal glasses filling the quiet room. He poured a generous measure of my favorite aged scotch. He remembered my specific brand. It was a small, chilling detail. He was attentive enough to know my favorite drink, yet ruthless enough to plan my institutionalization. He handed me the heavy glass, and I accepted it with a grateful nod, pretending to take a small sip, while actually just letting the liquor touch my lips. So I began letting a casual, inquisitive tone coat my words. "As I was walking up to the door, I thought I heard you two talking about a place called Sunny Pines, and something about a doctor waiting outside. Is everything all right? Is someone sick?" I watched them closely over the rim of my glass. I looked for the panic. I looked for the guilt. But what I saw sent a fresh wave of horror through my veins. Jason did not miss a single beat. He did not flinch. He did not look at his wife for help. He simply sighed a heavy, burdened sound and sat down on the armchair across from me. He rubbed the back of his neck, looking like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "You have sharp ears, Dad," Jason said, his voice laced with perfect manufactured sorrow. "We were actually just talking about Rachel's distant aunt. It is a really tragic situation. She was just diagnosed with severe early-onset Alzheimer's. We have been consulting with a Dr. Evans to figure out her long-term care plan. Sunny Pines is one of the secure facilities we were considering for her." Rachel immediately moved to sit next to him, placing a comforting hand on his knee. She looked at me with wide, sympathetic eyes. "It has been so incredibly stressful," she added, her voice softening into a delicate whisper. "It is just heartbreaking to watch someone you love lose their mind. We were getting a bit worked up about the logistics of it all. I am sorry if we sounded loud." They were absolutely flawless. If I had not heard the exact words through the cracked door, if I had not heard my own name being discussed like a piece of garbage, I would have believed every single syllable. I nodded slowly, offering them a look of deep fatherly sympathy. Internally, my stomach turned. My son was using a fictional, tragic illness to cover up his plot to destroy my life and steal my empire. "I am so sorry to hear that," I said, setting the glass of scotch down on the coffee table. "Dealing with cognitive decline is a terrible burden for any family. But you two have always been so strong together. I know you will handle it perfectly." Jason smiled, a brief, modest expression of gratitude. Then smoothly and without hesitation, he pivoted the conversation. "Thank you, Dad. But enough about our stress. We have so much to celebrate today. Did everything go well with the attorney? Are we still on track for the Medina house closing?" I patted my briefcase. "Everything is perfectly on track. I have the cashier's check right here. 1.5 million ready to go. I just want to see you two settled into your dream home." Rachel's eyes darted to the briefcase. For a fraction of a second, the sweet daughter-in-law mask slipped, and I saw raw, unadulterated greed flash across her face. It was the look of a starving animal staring at fresh meat. Jason leaned forward, clasping his hands together. He looked like the picture of a responsible, forward-thinking businessman. "Dad, I cannot begin to thank you for this," Jason said, his tone dripping with earnest appreciation. "You and Mom always worked so hard for us. But before we get to the check, there is a small hurdle we need to clear. I spoke with our financial advisor this morning, and the federal gift tax on a lump sum of 1.5 million is going to be an absolute nightmare for you." He reached under the coffee table and pulled out a thick manila folder. He opened it, revealing several stacks of dense legal documents tagged with bright yellow "Sign Here" stickers. He casually slid the stack of papers across the glass table toward me. "To avoid the heavy tax penalty, my accountant said, we just need you to sign these standard asset transfer forms," Jason explained smoothly. "It essentially routes the money through a family trust structure. And since the bank requires a secondary signatory for a trust of this size, they included a standard health directive and medical proxy. It is just red tape, Dad. Pure bureaucracy. But it saves us both hundreds of thousands in taxes." I stared down at the documents. They were thick, printed in small font, designed to be intimidating and exhausting to read. He was counting on my age. He was counting on my fatigue. Most importantly, he was counting on the unwavering trust a father has for his son. He expected me to blindly sign away my medical autonomy, giving him the legal power to have his corrupt doctor declare me unfit by tomorrow morning. "Just standard red tape," I repeated softly, letting my fingers brush the edge of the paper. "Exactly." Rachel chimed in, leaning forward with a helpful smile. She held out an expensive silver fountain pen. "Just sign where the yellow tabs are, Richard. We can get it all filed first thing tomorrow morning, and then the house is officially ours." I slowly reached out and took the heavy silver pen from her hand. I positioned the tip over the first yellow sticker. I watched Jason from the corner of my eye. His posture was rigid. He was holding his breath, waiting for the ink to touch the paper, waiting for the trap to spring shut forever. I pressed the pen down, but right before the ink flowed, I let my hand violently jerk. I dropped the pen onto the glass table with a loud clatter and pulled my right hand to my chest, grimacing in feigned agony. I rubbed my knuckles, letting out a sharp hiss of pain. "Dad, are you okay?" Jason asked, a flicker of genuine panic crossing his face. Not out of concern for my health, but pure fear that his plan was being derailed at the finish line. "My arthritis," I gasped, massaging my fingers. "It is acting up terribly today. The cold, damp air by the docks this morning must have triggered it. My hand is completely cramped up, son. I cannot even hold the pen steady." Rachel stared at my hand, her jaw tight, struggling to maintain her sympathetic facade. "Are you sure, Richard? It is just a few signatures. I can guide your hand if it helps you." No, I said, shaking my head and slowly packing the thick stack of documents into my briefcase alongside the cashier's check. "I do not want to ruin these official bank forms with a messy signature. They might reject it completely. Let me take these home. I will take my medication, rest my hand, review the paperwork tonight, and sign them properly in the morning. We can meet up for lunch, and I will hand everything over." Jason stared at the briefcase as I zipped it shut. I could see the gears turning in his head, desperately trying to find a valid reason to stop me from leaving with the papers and the money. But pushing too hard would break his careful illusion. He forced a smile and nodded. "Of course, Dad." "Your health comes first," Jason said, his voice strained. "Take them home. Read them over. We can handle it tomorrow." I stood up, adjusting my coat. I gave them both one last warm smile. "Thank you for understanding. I am so proud of you both. I will see you tomorrow." They walked me to the door, offering false hugs and hollow goodbyes. I stepped out into the hallway and walked toward the elevators, keeping my pace slow and steady. I pressed the call button and waited. The heavy doors chimed and slid open. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the parking garage. As the metal doors slid shut, sealing me inside the quiet elevator, the warm, oblivious smile vanished from my face entirely. My features settled into a cold, hardened stare. I looked down at the heavy briefcase in my hand, gripping the smooth leather handle tightly. I thought about the sheer audacity of what they were trying to accomplish. They thought they were playing a brilliant game of chess against an amateur. They thought they had backed a frail, helpless old man into a permanent corner. But my son had no idea the kind of ruthless, unrelenting war he had just started. The cold concrete of the underground parking garage echoed with my leather shoes. I walked to my car with a steady, measured pace. I unlocked the door, slid into the driver's seat, and let the heavy door thud shut, sealing me inside the absolute silence of the vehicle. I gripped the leather steering wheel, my chest rising and falling as I forced the adrenaline to settle. I had survived 40 years in the most ruthless sectors of the shipping industry. I knew how to turn a bleeding wound into cold, calculating focus. I reached over to the passenger seat and unlatched my briefcase. I pulled out the thick manila folder Jason had casually slid across his glass coffee table minutes ago. I flicked on the overhead dome light, casting a harsh glow over the pages. He told me these were standard asset transfer forms to avoid federal gift taxes on the $1.5 million. I began to peel away the bright yellow "Sign Here" stickers, uncovering the dense legal jargon hidden beneath them. I put on my reading glasses. It was not a tax form. It was a durable power of attorney. I scanned the meticulously drafted clauses. It was an ironclad medical proxy and a full conservatorship mandate. The documents were explicitly designed to strip me of every single legal right I possessed. If my pen had touched that paper, I would have handed Jason total control over my physical autonomy. They had actually written the name of the Sunny Pines Dementia Ward directly into the legal framework, but the betrayal went even deeper. I turned to the third section of the document, where the financial clauses were buried under complex corporate terminology. By signing that paper, I would have immediately surrendered my majority voting rights for the board of directors of my own company. I would have granted Jason the unchecked authority to liquidate my personal assets, empty my bank accounts, and sell my shares without any oversight. I lowered the documents, staring blankly at the dashboard. A bitter realization washed over me. I thought back to the decades I spent working on the freezing rain-soaked docks of Seattle. I remembered the agonizing ache in my lower back, the blistered hands the nights Diane and I sacrificed our own comfort so we could put every spare dollar into Jason's college fund. I paid absolute top dollar for his Ivy League education. I wanted him to have the sharpest mind in the room. I had paid for that elite education, and now he was using it to legally enslave his own father. He had absorbed every lesson about corporate loopholes, legal maneuvering, and ruthless efficiency, and he was applying those exact strategies to build my cage. He used the mind I financed to craft a flawless trap. The sheer level of premeditated cruelty was breathtaking. He had spent weeks consulting with corrupt lawyers to draft these documents perfectly. I set the papers down on the passenger seat. My breathing was slow and entirely controlled now. The initial heartbreak was gone, replaced by the sharp, analytical mindset of a CEO facing a hostile takeover. If the documents were a lie, I needed to test the other pillar of his story. The dream house in Medina. They claimed they needed the cashier's check to close on the estate tomorrow morning. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name Sarah. She was a highly respected luxury real estate agent I had personally recommended to Jason and Rachel when they first started looking for homes in the affluent suburbs. I tapped her name and put the phone to my ear, listening to it ring in the quiet car. Sarah picked up on the third ring. "Richard, it is so wonderful to hear from you," she answered, her tone bright and professional. "How are you doing?" "I am doing quite well, Sarah, thank you," I replied, keeping my voice utterly relaxed and pleasant. "I am calling about Jason and Rachel. I am holding the cashier's check for their down payment on the Medina property, and I wanted to touch base with you. I want to make sure the title company has everything they need for the closing tomorrow morning. I do not want any delays." There was a sudden heavy pause on the other end of the line. The professional tone completely vanished from Sarah's voice. When she finally spoke, she sounded incredibly confused, treading very carefully. "Richard," she started, hesitating for a fraction of a second. "I am not entirely sure I understand. Jason pulled out of the escrow process on the Medina estate 3 weeks ago." I stared straight ahead through the windshield, my grip tightening on the phone. "Are you certain, Sarah? They were incredibly excited about that property." "I am absolutely certain," she replied, her voice dropping lower, clearly sensing that she had stumbled into a massive family issue. "He sent over a formal cancellation notice. He forfeited his earnest money deposit to break the contract. It was a $50,000 penalty, Richard. I tried to talk him out of it, but he insisted the deal was off. There is no closing scheduled for tomorrow. They do not have an active offer on any property." I closed my eyes for a brief moment, digesting the sheer magnitude of the deception. "Thank you, Sarah," I said, my voice perfectly steady. "It seems there has simply been a miscommunication on the timeline between Jason and my accounting department. I appreciate you clearing that up for me. Have a wonderful evening." I ended the call and placed the phone carefully on the center console. The silence of the garage pressed against the windows of my car. The pieces of the puzzle were rapidly clicking together, forming a terrifying picture. There was no dream house in Medina. There was no closing tomorrow. Yet Jason and Rachel were desperate to get their hands on a certified check for $1.5 million in liquid cash by tomorrow morning. They were willing to trick me into signing away my life and lock me in a dementia ward to ensure I could never ask where the money went. The math did not add up. If they were not buying real estate, why the aggressive immediate need for such a massive sum of money? Why forfeit $50,000 in a sudden panic just to back out of a legitimate contract? It was not just pure naked greed. It was absolute, undeniable desperation. They were trying to cover something up. There was a massive financial black hole somewhere in their lives, and it was threatening to swallow them whole. Someone was demanding exactly $1.5 million by tomorrow, and Jason was willing to sacrifice his father to pay that debt. I looked over at my briefcase, knowing the check inside was the only thing standing between my son and total ruin. He thought he was playing me. He thought I was a stepping stone. But tomorrow he was going to learn exactly why I was the one who built the empire. I left the parking garage and merged onto the wet Seattle streets. The city lights blurred against the windshield. I headed straight for the industrial district on the city outskirts. I pulled into a dingy 24-hour diner. Greg Harrison sat in a cracked vinyl booth at the back. Greg was a ruthless old-school private investigator. I had kept him on retainer for over 2 decades. In the shipping business, you needed a man like Greg to vet corporate rivals and dig up the skeletons they tried to bury. He was a man of very few words and absolute discretion. I slid into the booth facing him. He did not ask how I was. He looked at the heavy leather briefcase I placed on the sticky table. I opened it and pulled out the thick stack of fraudulent legal documents Jason had given me. I slid them across the table along with a blank signed check from my personal account. Greg picked up the papers, his eyes scanning the dense legal jargon of the medical proxy and the durable power of attorney. He looked up at me, his expression entirely unreadable. I leaned forward, keeping my voice low and completely steady over the hum of the diner's ventilation system. I need you to dig into every single inch of my son and his wife's lives, I told him. Leave absolutely no stone unturned. I want their bank records, their offshore accounts, their phone logs, and their private emails. I want to know exactly what they have been doing for the last 3 years. Greg folded the documents and tucked them into his jacket. He tapped his finger against the blank check. "You know I do not come cheap, Richard," he murmured. I looked him dead in the eyes. "I do not care what it costs," I said. "Just find out what financial black hole they are trying to cover up with my money. Find out why they are so desperate to lock me away." Greg nodded once, sliding out of the booth. "You will have answers in 48 hours, he promised, disappearing into the rainy night. I stayed in the booth for a few more minutes, sipping a cup of bitter black coffee. The caffeine mixed with the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I pulled out my cell phone. I needed to buy time. I needed to keep Jason and Rachel completely docile and oblivious, while Greg tore their entire world apart. I opened my text messages and navigated to my chat with Jason. I carefully typed out a message, making sure to use the polite, slightly confused tone of an elderly father who did not understand modern banking protocols. "Good evening, son," I typed. "I just got off the phone with my lawyer and the bank manager. Because of the sheer size of the cashier's check, they have informed me that it will trigger an automatic security hold. They said the bank needs a full 48 hours to clear a sum of $1.5 million. I am so sorry for the delay, but we have to hold tight. I will bring the cleared funds and the signed paperwork to you as soon as the bank lifts the restriction. Have a wonderful night." I pressed send and watched the little bubble appear on the screen. It took less than 30 seconds for the read receipt to show up. A minute later, Jason replied, "No problem at all, Dad. The title company said they can extend the closing window for a few days without any penalties. Your health and peace of mind are the most important things. Take your time. We love you." The sheer hypocrisy of his message made my stomach churn, but it also fueled my determination. They had taken the bait. They believed they were still in complete control of the board. I drove back to my estate and waited in the suffocating silence of my home until the grandfather clock in the hallway struck 2 in the morning. I changed into dark, unassuming clothes. Several months ago, Jason had given me a spare electronic key fob to their luxury condo complex, claiming it was for emergencies in case he ever needed me to check on their Kethont while they traveled. He had handed me the tool of his own destruction. I drove back downtown, parking a few blocks away from their building to avoid the security cameras at the main entrance. I pulled my collar up against the freezing wind and walked to the underground parking garage. The spare key fob blinked green, and the heavy metal gate slowly rolled open. The garage was cavernous, echoing with the faint hum of luxury vehicles. I moved silently through the shadows until I found Rachel's pristine white Range Rover parked in their assigned spot. I dropped to my knees on the cold concrete. From my pocket, I pulled out a military-grade GPS and audio recording bug. It was a sophisticated piece of technology I had acquired years ago to track a fleet of stolen shipping containers. It was the size of a matchbox equipped with a powerful magnetic backing and a battery that would last for weeks. I reached up under the rear bumper, sliding my hand past the exhaust pipe until I found a secure, hidden metal bracket. I pressed the device firmly against the steel, hearing the magnetic click as it locked into place. I activated the transmitter with my phone, confirming the steady pulsing signal. I stood up, brushed the dust from my knees, and walked away into the darkness, leaving their precious vehicle hopelessly compromised. The next morning, I sat at my mahogany dining table, with a fresh cup of coffee, staring at the tracking application open on my encrypted laptop. At exactly 8:30, the little blue dot representing Rachel's vehicle began to move on the digital map. I put on my headphones and activated the live audio feed. There was a brief burst of static followed by the muffled sound of the vehicle's engine. Then I heard Rachel's voice. It was clear and incredibly sharp. However, she was not talking to my son. She was completely engaged in a highly heated, very hushed private phone conversation over the car's Bluetooth system. She was speaking to a man she called Victor. The tone she used with him was intimately familiar, dripping with a secretive, urgent kind of affection. "Listen to me, Victor," Rachel said, her voice trembling with excitement. "Jason just texted. The old man's bank is holding the funds for 48 hours, but the money is guaranteed. We are almost at the finish line. I need you to go ahead and book the flights right now." Yes, exactly what we discussed. 2 one-way first-class tickets to the Cayman Islands for this Friday night. I felt a very cold chill run down my spine as I listened to her laugh. Jason had absolutely no idea that he was not the brilliant architect of this betrayal. He was just another oblivious victim being led directly to the slaughter by the woman he trusted the most. The audio of Rachel laughing with this unknown man named Victor echoed in the cramped cabin of my car. Cayman Islands. First class. One way. The sheer brazenness made my jaw clench so hard my teeth ached. My son was conspiring to declare me incompetent, to steal my empire, and his wife was conspiring to steal the fortune from him and flee the country. It was a nest of vipers, and I had been paying for their condo. I turned off the receiver, shifted into drive, and pulled out of the parking garage. I steered toward the industrial district, heading for the headquarters of Sterling Logistics. I needed to see exactly what Jason was doing to my company. I parked in my reserved spot and walked through the heavy glass double doors of the lobby. Forklifts beeped in the massive warehouse beyond the glass partitions. Diesel fumes and fresh rain mingled in the air. As I walked past the loading bays, a vivid memory flashed in my mind. Jason was 16 years old, wearing an oversized safety vest, sitting next to me on the worn vinyl seat of a yellow forklift. I had spent hours teaching him how to balance a heavy pallet, navigating tight warehouse corners. I told him that day that a real company is built on the sweat of the people on the floor, not by the guys sitting upstairs in expensive suits. I wanted him to respect the labor that put food on our table. He had nodded, but I realized now he was just waiting to get back to his video games. He never respected the sweat. He only respected the money. I walked up the metal stairs to the executive suite. I walked right past his corner office. Through the frosted glass, I could see him sitting at his custom walnut desk, wearing a tailored Italian suit, speaking confidently into a headset. I kept my head down and moved swiftly down the hallway to the IT department. As the founder and primary shareholder, I had supreme administrative clearance that even Jason did not know about. I bypassed the main floor and swiped my master keycard to enter the secure, climate-controlled server room. The heavy door clicked shut behind me, plunging me into the hum of towering data racks and flashing green lights. I pulled out my secure laptop and connected it directly to the primary financial server. 5 minutes later, the door opened silently. Greg slipped into the room, his trench coat damp from the Seattle rain. He did not say a word, pulling up a chair beside me and plugging a decrypted hard drive into my computer. "We need to bypass the polished quarterly reports Jason gives the board," I told Greg, my voice barely a whisper over the cooling fans. "I need the raw, unfiltered transaction logs for the last 24 months. Every wire transfer, every vendor payment, every payroll deduction." Greg nodded, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "You are the boss, Richard," he muttered. "Let us see what the golden boy is hiding." It took 45 minutes of digging through encrypted subfolders before the first crack appeared. Greg tapped his pen against the screen, pointing to a series of recurring wire transfers. "Look at these vendor payouts, Richard. They are massive. 300,000 here, 500,000 there. They are all being routed to a network of 4 shell companies registered in Delaware and Nevada. They are billed as advanced logistics consulting and international freight optimization." I leaned closer, squinting at the screen. "I have never heard of these consulting firms. I know every major player in the West Coast shipping industry. These are ghosts." Greg ran a rapid background trace on the corporate registry numbers. They were completely hollow entities. No employees, no physical offices, just registered agents and offshore routing numbers. Jason was authorizing massive payouts for phantom services. But the money had to be coming from somewhere. The corporate operating margins were tight, and we did not have that kind of liquid cash sitting idle in the accounts payable ledger. I pulled up the internal routing data to trace the origin of the funds. What I saw made the blood drain entirely from my face. My hands began to shake, not from feigned arthritis, but from a profound, terrifying rage. "He is not stealing from the operating budget," I whispered, pointing a trembling finger at the origin codes. "He is draining the employee pension fund." Greg stared at the screen, his face hardening. Over the past 2 years, Jason had systematically embezzled $12 million from the retirement accounts of my warehouse workers, drivers, and dockmen. The people who broke their backs to build my empire. The people I promised to protect. Jason had hollowed out their futures to fund his lavish lifestyle and his phantom corporations. $12 million. It was a staggering, astronomical theft. A corporate crime of this magnitude would carry decades in federal prison. But as I stared at the numbers, a glaring inconsistency jumped out at me. If Jason had stolen $12 million over the last 2 years, why was he suddenly so desperate for my $1.5 million certified check? Why the panicked rush to lock me in a dementia ward by tomorrow morning? A man with $12 million in offshore accounts does not panic over a real estate deposit. I instructed Greg to follow the money flowing out of the dummy shell corporations. "We need to see where Jason actually parked the stolen pension funds," I said, my voice cold and hollow. Greg ran a deep financial diagnostic, tracking the wire transfers across international borders. The truth hit me like a physical blow. Jason did not park the money in a safe offshore trust. He had funneled the entire $12 million into aggressive, high-risk offshore cryptocurrency derivatives and leveraged margin trading. He thought he was a financial genius. He thought he could double the pension fund, put the original money back, and pocket the massive profits before the annual audit. But the market had crashed violently 3 weeks ago. His leveraged positions were entirely wiped out. The $12 million was completely gone, evaporated into thin air. But it was even worse than that. To cover his massive margin call and keep the trading platforms from liquidating his remaining assets, Jason had taken out a high-interest short-term bridge loan. Greg pulled up the creditor details. It was an unlicensed lending syndicate operating out of Macau, with undeniable ties to international cartels. Jason had borrowed exactly $1.5 million to stay afloat. The loan was due in full by tomorrow at noon. The check in my coat pocket was never meant for a beautiful dream home in Medina. It was the exact sum required to pay off a ruthless cartel-linked loan shark. If Jason did not deliver that borrowed money tomorrow morning, he was not just facing federal prison for embezzlement. He was facing ruthless men who did not care about laws. Jason had backed himself into a lethal corner. His only possible way out was completely destroying my own life forever. The realization hit me. I gripped the server rack to keep my knees from buckling. Physical nausea washed over my body. I squeezed my eyes shut, banishing the vivid image of my son shaking hands with men who would kill him over a missed payment. He was drowning in a toxic ocean of his own unbridled greed and monumental arrogance. He had gambled the livelihoods of my employees on a desperate and reckless bet, and when he lost, he decided to sacrifice his father to save his skin. I opened my eyes and looked at the glowing monitors. It was a tragedy of epic proportions, but I was about to discover that the true evil of the plan my son created had not even been fully revealed. Greg finally broke the silence, his voice unusually strained. He pushed his chair back from the desk and gestured for me to come closer to the primary terminal. "Richard, you need to look at this right now," Greg said, pointing a calloused finger at a series of digital authorization forms populating the right side of the screen. I stepped forward, forcing my shaking hands deep into my pockets. I leaned over his shoulder, squinting at the high-resolution images of the wire transfer approvals that had authorized the movement of the $12 million into the dummy shell corporations. At first glance, everything looked like standard corporate paperwork. The formatting was correct, the dates aligned with our fiscal calendar, and the required secondary approvals were stamped in the margins. But then my eyes drifted down to the bottom right corner of the primary authorization line. A cold, sharp knife of absolute dread twisted in my gut. The signature printed on the digital line did not belong to Jason. It was my signature. It was my exact, distinctive scrawl, perfectly replicated down to the slight loop I always put on the capital letter of my first name. I stared at it, completely paralyzed, as Greg pulled up document after document. Every single fraudulent transfer, every single illegal diversion of pension funds bore my explicit digital and physical signature. "He did not just sign your name, Richard," Greg muttered, his fingers flying across the keyboard to open a separate diagnostic window. "Look at the login credentials. The system shows that these transfers were initiated using your personal administrative account. Your master password was used to bypass the security protocols." I shook my head slowly, trying to process the magnitude of the deception. Jason was the only other person on the planet who had access to my emergency master login. I gave it to him 2 years ago when I made him the chief operating officer, just in case something ever happened to me while I was traveling abroad. I handed him the keys to the castle because I trusted him implicitly. Greg kept digging, running a complex tracer program on the network traffic. "It gets worse," Greg continued, his voice dropping to a low, grim whisper. "I am pulling the network protocol data for the exact moments these $12 million were moved. The transfers were not executed from the office of Jason. They were not executed from his laptop or his phone. The network logs show that the IP address attached to every single one of these fraudulent transactions bounces directly back to the private residential router at your Medina estate. Jason had driven to my house, sat in my living room connected to my personal home network, and used my private administrative credentials to forge my signature on the theft of $12 million. He had built an airtight digital footprint that pointed directly to me. I stood perfectly still in the painfully freezing air of the darkened server room. The noise of the cooling fans faded into a dull hum. I closed my eyes as the entire monstrous architecture of the plan Jason created clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The pieces of the puzzle aligned perfectly, revealing a picture of such profound malice that it took my breath away. It explained every single bizarre interaction over the last few weeks. It explained the frantic rush for the $1.5 million certified check. And most importantly, it explained the desperate immediate need for the medical proxy and the fabricated dementia diagnosis. The federal auditors were scheduled to review our corporate accounts at the end of the next fiscal quarter. There was absolutely no way to hide a missing $12 million from a federal audit. When the agents inevitably arrived, they would follow the paper trail. They would look at the authorization forms. They would see my signature. They would verify my login credentials, and they would trace the IP address directly to my living room in Medina. I would become the sole target of a massive federal investigation for corporate embezzlement and fraud. If I was a healthy, capable CEO, I would immediately hire the absolute best corporate defense attorneys in the entire country. I would order my own forensic audit. I would fight the charges with every ounce of my strength, and eventually I would prove that Jason was the one manipulating the system. Jason knew this. He knew he could never outsmart me in a fair fight in a court of law. That was precisely why the dementia evaluation, with the corrupt doctor and his clinic, was so critical to his survival. When the FBI came knocking on my door with a federal warrant, they would not find a sharp, capable corporate titan ready to mount a defense. They would find a confused, medically incapacitated old man locked away in the secure wing of the Sunny Pines dementia ward. Jason would proudly stand there playing the perfect role of the tragic, heartbroken son. He would tearfully hand the investigating federal agents my legally signed medical proxy. He would show them the falsified evaluation. He would shake his head and tell them that his poor father had lost his mind, that my cognitive decline had driven me to do erratic, crazy things like draining the employee pension fund and throwing it into volatile crypto markets. No one would ever truly believe my very desperate defense. If I tried to tell the authorities that my son framed me, they would simply view it as the paranoid, tragic ramblings of a man suffering from severe dementia. I would not even be allowed to stand trial. I would be transferred to a federal medical prison or a locked psychiatric ward. I stood in the server room, the cold air biting at my skin, as the ultimate realization washed over my soul. My son did not just want to steal my wealth. He did not just want to take my company. He had meticulously engineered a flawless, inescapable trap to let me die alone in a federal prison hospital so he could walk away completely clean. His survival required my absolute destruction. The heartbreak I had felt yesterday completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. The man who loved Jason was dead. Now he was dealing with the ruthless man who had successfully built the entire empire from the ground up. I left the freezing climate control of the server room and drove straight to Greg's office. The rain was coming down in thick gray sheets washing over the windshield, but my mind was completely consumed by the monstrous reality of my son's betrayal. I walked into Greg's dimly lit workspace. The stale scent of stale coffee and old paper hung in the air. He was already sitting behind his cluttered desk, his eyes glued to a dual monitor setup. I sank heavily into the worn leather chair opposite him. My hands were still cold. I had just discovered that the boy I raised, the boy I loved more than anything in this world, had meticulously engineered my downfall. He had framed me for a $12 million federal crime. He intended to lock me in a dementia ward and leave me to take the fall for his cartel-linked debts. I sat there in stunned silence, staring at the floor. But the nightmare was far from over. Greg tapped his keyboard and slid a pair of heavy noise-canceling headphones across the desk. He told me the audio files from the bug I placed in Rachel's car had been downloading all morning. There were hours of conversations. I put the headphones over my ears and adjusted the volume. I expected to hear more of their joint conspiring, more of Rachel complaining about my stories, or perhaps Jason finalizing the details of his corrupt medical proxy. What I heard instead completely shattered any remaining understanding I had of this situation. The audio started with the ambient noise of a luxury vehicle driving down the highway. Then the Bluetooth system chimed, connecting a call. I heard Rachel's voice. It was entirely different from the venomous tone she used when speaking about me, and it lacked the dismissive, impatient edge she often used with Jason. Her voice was smooth, melodic, and dripping with a deep, breathless intimacy. She was speaking to the man named Victor. Yesterday, I had assumed Victor was simply a discreet travel agent booking their getaway flights. I could not have been more wrong. As I listened to the crystal-clear audio, the true identity of this man was laid bare. Victor was not a travel agent. He was a high-end offshore wealth manager based in the Cayman Islands. And he was much more than just a financial contact. He was Rachel's lover. The conversation was incredibly explicit. They exchanged passionate, hushed promises about the future. They talked about the private villa they had already purchased on 7 Mile Beach, discussing the custom furnishings and the view from the balcony. Rachel was laughing a carefree, genuine laugh that I had never once heard her use in the presence of my son. She was completely in love with this man, and she was manipulating Jason with a level of sociopathic precision that made my blood run cold. I sat in Greg's office listening to my daughter-in-law orchestrate the ultimate deception. I kept listening as the romantic banter slowly shifted into cold, hard logistics. Victor asked her about the timeline, his voice smooth and incredibly confident. He wanted to know if Jason had secured the final payment. Rachel's response made the air in my lungs vanish. I listened to her laughing with Victor, a cruel mocking sound that echoed through the headphones. "Once Jason gets the $1.5 million from the old man tomorrow," she said, her voice dripping with absolute malice, "I am transferring it straight into our offshore account. The routing numbers are already queued up. I am leaving Jason holding the bag for the FBI and the cartel. He is entirely too stupid to realize I have been using him this entire time to drain his father's empire. He thinks we are running away together. He actually thinks I want to spend the rest of my life with him." My hands gripped the armrests of the leather chair. Victor chuckled on the other end of the line, praising her brilliance. Rachel went on to detail her entire master plan. She knew all about the missing $12 million. She knew about the forged signatures and the fake consulting firms. She had encouraged Jason to take those massive risks, manipulating his ego and feeding his greed. She pushed him to borrow from the loan sharks, knowing the pressure would force him to extract the final lump sum from me. She was the one who suggested the dementia ward. She engineered the entire frame up so that both Jason and I would be utterly destroyed. Her plan was a masterpiece of absolute betrayal. She was going to take the 1.5 million, merge it with the hidden millions she had already skimmed from Jason's fraudulent accounts, and vanish to a tropical paradise with her lover. Jason was going to be left completely penniless, facing a hostile cartel debt he could not pay, and an inevitable federal indictment he could not escape. He was a pawn in his own wife's game. I pulled the headphones off, letting them drop onto Greg's desk. The silence in the room felt incredibly heavy. My mind was spinning violently. Jason was actively planning to destroy me, to lock me away and let me die in federal prison. But Rachel was planning to destroy both of us. A sudden, agonizing surge of paternal instinct flared up in my chest. Despite everything he had done, Jason was still my blood. He was still the boy I had raised, the only piece of Diane I had left in this world. He was walking blindly into an absolute slaughterhouse. Rachel and Victor were going to leave him to the mercy of violent criminals and federal prosecutors. My first instinct was to pick up my phone, call my son, and warn him. I wanted to shake him awake, to show him the audio files and prove that the woman he married was a venomous snake about to deliver a fatal strike. I wanted to save him from the ruin he had so foolishly orchestrated. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the cold glass of my cell phone. But as I pulled it out, a sudden, terrifying wave of dizziness crashed over me. The room tilted violently to the left. I grabbed the edge of the desk to steady myself, but my grip was incredibly weak. A thick, suffocating fog rolled into my brain, unclouding my vision and muddling my thoughts. My heart began to palpitate wildly in my chest. I tried to speak, to tell Greg I needed help, but the words felt thick and heavy on my tongue. I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting a wave of intense nausea. This was not the normal fatigue of a 70-year-old man. This was a severe, unnatural chemical reaction, taking over my entire nervous system. The terrifying health issues I had been ignoring over the last few weeks were violently accelerating. I collapsed back into the chair, realizing with absolute horror that I was rapidly losing control of my own body. I was out of time. Everything was going dark. "Help me! Help me!" The words barely escaped my lips before a heavy, suffocating darkness pulled me under. I woke up with a sharp gasp, my lungs violently pulling in the stale, paper-scented air of the private investigator's office. I was lying back against the worn leather sofa. Greg was standing over me, his rough hands gripping my shoulders, his face pulled tight with genuine alarm. He was holding a cold, damp towel to the back of my neck. He asked me if I was having a heart attack if he needed to call for an ambulance immediately. I slowly shook my head, fighting back another nauseating wave of vertigo as I forced myself into a sitting position. The room was still spinning slightly, the edges of my vision blurred by a thick, heavy fog. I told Greg to wait. I closed my eyes and focused entirely on my breathing, analyzing the strange, synthetic numbness radiating through my limbs. This was not a stroke. This was not a heart attack. And as the initial panic began to recede, a deeply unsettling pattern began to emerge in my mind. Over the last 4 or 5 weeks, I had been experiencing these exact same symptoms, though in much smaller, more insidious doses. I had been suffering from unusual crushing lethargy. I had been experiencing severe brain fog, losing my train of thought in the middle of board meetings and forgetting the names of colleagues I had known for over 2 decades. I had suffered through terrifying memory lapses, where I would walk into my kitchen and completely forget what I was looking for, standing there blankly for several minutes. I had fully attributed all of these terrifying moments to the natural progression of old age and the lingering heavy grief of losing my beloved wife. I thought my mind was simply tired. But sitting there in the dim light of Greg's office, recovering from a near-total blackout, a much darker, much more sinister reality began to take shape. My mind drifted back to the sudden, uncharacteristic changes in my son's behavior over the exact same timeline. About a month ago, Jason had started coming over to my Medina estate every single Sunday morning without fail. He claimed he wanted to spend more quality time with his aging father. He would always walk through my front door, carrying a sleek, unmarked black foil bag of coffee beans. He told me it was an exclusive imported organic coffee blend that his personal nutritionist had highly recommended. Jason insisted that it was exceptionally good for cardiovascular health and cognitive function. He was so incredibly persistent about it. He would go into my kitchen, grind the beans himself, and brew a fresh pot, standing over me with a warm, caring smile until I drank every last drop of the bitter, earthy liquid. He even began replacing my regular coffee supply, meticulously stocking my pantry with these unmarked black bags, telling my housekeeper to throw away everything else and only brew this specific blend for me every single morning. I had been so touched by his apparent devotion. I thought my son was finally stepping up, finally caring for my well-being. The realization hit my stomach like a block of solid ice. I looked up at Greg, my vision clearing, as pure, unadulterated adrenaline flooded my system. I told him to grab his keys. We needed to go to my estate immediately, and then we needed to find the best private toxicology laboratory in the state of Washington. Greg did not ask a single question. He simply grabbed his coat, helped me to my feet, and guided me out to his unmarked sedan. The drive to my home took less than 20 minutes. I walked straight into my sprawling, immaculate kitchen, bypassed the expensive espresso machine, and opened the primary pantry. There they were. 6 identical unmarked black foil bags sitting perfectly aligned on the middle shelf. I grabbed 3 of them, my hands trembling with a mixture of profound sorrow and absolute burning rage. We drove back into the city, heading straight to an elite, discreet medical testing facility that catered to high-net-worth clients who required absolute confidentiality. I walked up to the pristine glass reception desk, placed the 3 bags of coffee grounds on the counter, and slid my platinum credit card across the polished marble surface. I demanded a comprehensive, expedited chemical breakdown of the contents. I told the lab director I did not care what it cost or what other tests had to be delayed. I needed a full toxicological profile within the hour. The director saw the utter desperation and absolute fury in my eyes, nodded silently, and rushed the bags directly back to their primary testing bay. Greg and I sat in the sterile, aggressively lit waiting room for exactly 54 minutes. I did not speak. I did not look at my phone. I simply stared at the blank white wall opposite my chair, bracing myself for the final shattering blow to my fatherhood. Finally, the heavy wooden door to the testing area opened. The lead toxicologist walked out holding a thick, freshly printed report. His face was completely ashen. He did not look at me with the detached professionalism of a scientist. He looked at me with the deep, visceral pity of a man who had just uncovered a horrific crime. He asked me to step into his private consultation office. Greg followed closely behind me, his presence a silent, looming threat. The doctor sat behind his desk, placed the report down, and folded his hands. He asked me how much of this substance I had been consuming, and for how long. I told him I had been drinking a large cup of it every single morning for roughly 5 weeks. The doctor closed his eyes and let out a slow, trembling breath. He looked at me and stated that it was an absolute miracle I was still conscious, let alone standing and functioning. The unmarked bags did not just contain organic coffee grounds. The coffee had been meticulously and heavily laced with a highly concentrated synthetic cocktail of severe central nervous system depressants. He turned the report around and pointed to the primary chemical compounds highlighted in bright red ink. The highest concentration was flunitrazepam, a potent, fast-acting muscle relaxant and amnesiac. But the horror did not stop there. The flunitrazepam had been expertly bonded with a heavy dose of haloperidol and a cocktail of unregulated cognitive suppressants designed to drastically impair memory, severely disrupt speech patterns, and induce violent, unpredictable mood swings. The doctor explained that whoever mixed this compound possessed advanced pharmacological knowledge. They had specifically designed the chemical ratio to avoid inducing a sudden fatal overdose. Instead, it was crafted to slowly, methodically degrade the neural pathways over time. It was a precise recipe designed to flawlessly mimic the exact rapid onset symptoms of aggressive terminal dementia. I stared at the medical report, tracing the red letters with my eyes, as the absolute crushing reality of my situation finally settled over my shoulders. This was the final devastating piece of their monstrous puzzle. Jason and Rachel were not just hoping that I would eventually lose my mind so they could easily take control of my $80 million empire. They were not just eagerly waiting for a natural age-related cognitive decline. They were actively chemically poisoning my brain. They were deliberately and systematically murdering my mind from the inside out. They knew perfectly well that corrupt doctors and fake medical proxies would only get them so far if I was still sharp enough to effectively defend myself and answer questions coherently. They needed me to be a broken, babbling, incoherent shell of a human being when the evaluation took place. They needed me to fail the cognitive test with Dr. Evans tomorrow morning, so spectacularly that absolutely no legal authority would ever question their decision to lock me away forever in a secure psychiatric ward. My own flesh and blood, the boy I had loved unconditionally, had been looking me directly in the eyes every Sunday morning, smiling warmly, while he personally handed me a cup of slow-acting poison. He was entirely willing to destroy my brain permanently, erase my cherished memories of his mother, and leave me trapped in a chemical prison for the rest of my natural life, all to cover up his own pathetic, arrogant failures and pay off his massive cartel debts. The profound sadness that had anchored me to my past finally snapped, vanishing completely into the cold ether. The loving, fiercely protective father I had been for 40 years died right there in that sterile clinic chair. I reached out, carefully folded the toxicology report, and placed it securely in my breast pocket. I turned to Greg, my expression utterly devoid of any remaining mercy, empathy, or hesitation. The time for quietly gathering evidence was officially over. It was time to execute a flawless, total destruction. The drive back to the city was completely silent. The heavy rain battered the windshield of Greg's sedan. I sat in the passenger seat staring out at the blurred Seattle skyline. Any remaining trace of paternal love I had harbored for Jason simply evaporated into the cold, damp air. For 40 years, I had viewed him through the forgiving, protective lens of a father. I had excused his arrogance and funded his failures. But sitting in that clinic holding the physical proof that my own flesh and blood was actively poisoning my brain to secure my ruin, the father inside me died. I did not cry. I did not feel the urge to scream. I felt absolutely nothing but the icy, calculating instinct of the self-made titan who had clawed his way to the top of the corporate world. You do not survive 3 decades in the cutthroat logistics industry by showing mercy to the people trying to destroy you. You survive by burying them completely. I turned to Greg and I told him to bypass Sterling Logistics entirely. We needed to go straight to the downtown high-rise of my elite corporate attorney, Thomas Mitchell. Thomas was a brilliant, ruthless legal tactician. I pulled out my secure mobile device. I had one more critical call to make. I dialed the direct unlisted number of Special Agent Marcus Thorne, an old trusted contact at the Federal Bureau of Investigation at the White Collar Crime Division. Marcus and I had crossed paths years ago during an industry-wide task force on port corruption. I knew he was thorough, relentless, and completely immune to corporate bribery. I told Marcus it was an absolute emergency of the highest order involving massive corporate embezzlement, cartel money, and attempted murder. I told him to meet me at the office of Thomas Mitchell in exactly 45 minutes. When Greg and I walked into the plush, mahogany-paneled conference room on the 50th floor, Thomas was already waiting. Marcus arrived precisely on time, flashing his federal credentials as he stepped through the heavy oak doors. We locked the room, disabled all electronic communication devices, and I laid every single piece of evidence out on the massive glass table. I placed the decrypted server logs showing the $12 million embezzlement next to the forged financial transfers. I set the audio transcripts of Rachel conspiring with her offshore wealth manager right beside the cartel loan documents. Finally, I placed the expedited toxicology report dead center. Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, rubbing his temples in disbelief. He looked at me, his sharp eyes filled with a new level of respect. He explicitly stated that Jason had built a highly sophisticated, multi-layered trap designed to hand me over to the federal government as the perfect medically incompetent scapegoat. But Jason had made one fatal error. He had left a digital footprint. We spent the next 4 hours meticulously dismantling my son's entire strategy. I looked Marcus dead in the eye and told him I would give the Bureau absolutely everything. I would hand over the cartel connections, the offshore accounts, and the dummy shell corporations. I agreed to act as a fully cooperative, confidential informant for the federal government. In exchange, Marcus produced a highly classified federal affidavit. I sat at the table and carefully signed the document, formally detailing the unauthorized use of my administrative login credentials and proving definitively that the IP addresses on the fraudulent wire transfers belonged to Jason. That single signature granted me absolute sweeping legal immunity from the financial fallout of the $12 million theft. I was no longer a suspect. I was the key federal witness. While Marcus coordinated with his tactical teams to verify the cartel links and freeze the offshore routing numbers Rachel was using, Thomas went to work on the corporate execution. His fingers flew across his keyboard as he drafted the most aggressive, ironclad legal documents of his entire career. With my full authority as the primary shareholder and founder, Thomas immediately drafted the termination papers permanently dissolving Jason's position as Chief Operating Officer of Sterling Logistics. But we did not stop there. Thomas contacted our primary banking institutions utilizing his top-tier executive clearance. He initiated an absolute catastrophic freeze on every single corporate and personal account attached to Jason and Rachel. He locked down their credit cards, their investment portfolios, their mutual funds, and their emergency savings. I even had Thomas revoke their access to the luxury condo I had purchased under the company trust. By the time the sun began to set over the Seattle skyline, Jason and Rachel were completely and utterly penniless. They just did not know it yet. They were still happily sitting in their expensive condominium, blissfully unaware that the ground beneath their feet had simply ceased to exist. The trap was flawlessly constructed. The federal agents were quietly moving into position, monitoring the Macau syndicate, and the flights Rachel had booked to the Cayman Islands. Every escape route had been heavily barricaded with federal warrants and frozen assets. All that remained was the final defining act of the play. I needed to bring the rats directly into the snare. I needed them to feel completely victorious, utterly convinced that their brilliant twisted machinations had succeeded. I sat alone at the end of the long glass table after Thomas and Marcus had left the room to finalize the federal warrants. The silence of the high-rise office was profound. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and opened my text messages. I navigated to my active chat thread with Jason. I stared at his name on the screen. The last message he had sent me was full of fake affection, telling me to take my time, telling me how much he loved me. The sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy of his words no longer made me feel sick. It just confirmed that I was doing the exact right thing. I placed my thumbs over the digital keyboard and carefully crafted my message, making sure to use the polite, slightly relieved tone of a grateful, accommodating father. "Good news, son," I typed, the letters appearing bright against the dark screen. "The bank manager just called me personally. The hold has been completely lifted, and the $1.5 million has fully cleared. Come to my estate this Friday night with Rachel. We will have a wonderful celebratory dinner together. I will sign all of your medical proxy forms, and I will finally hand over the certified check so you can close on your beautiful new home. I love you both." I took a deep, steady breath, feeling the absolute weight of the moment, and pressed send. I placed the phone flat on the glass table and watched the screen. Exactly 10 agonizing seconds passed. The tiny read receipt indicator popped up. A moment later, the typing bubble appeared. Jason replied with a string of joyous words, thanking me, promising they would be there right at 7 o'clock. I carefully locked the screen and slid the phone back into my pocket. The trap was now perfectly and inescapably set. Friday evening descended upon my Medina estate with a heavy, steady downpour that battered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of my formal dining room. The house was entirely silent, save for the rhythmic drumming of the rain and the low crackle of the fire burning in the massive stone hearth. I stood alone in the center of the room, looking over the grand mahogany table. I had instructed my household staff to leave early for the weekend, ensuring that there would be absolutely no witnesses and no interruptions. I had personally set the table for 3. The heavy silver cutlery gleamed under the soft, warm light of the crystal chandelier overhead. The fine porcelain plates were perfectly aligned, and the imported linen napkins were folded with absolute precision. It was a setting worthy of a celebration, a final meal, before a profound transition of power. But the true centerpiece of the table was not the floral arrangement or the expensive bottle of vintage red wine breathing quietly on the sideboard. Exactly in the middle of the dark, polished wood, illuminated perfectly by the overhead lights, sat the $1.5 million certified cashier check. I placed it face up, its bold printed numbers impossible to miss. Right beside the check, I laid out the thick stack of fraudulent medical proxy and durable power of attorney documents Jason had given me earlier in the week. A heavy gold-plated fountain pen rested neatly on top of the signature page, waiting to finalize my own destruction. I stepped back, admiring the terrifying perfection of the bait. It was the ultimate physical manifestation of their boundless greed laid out on a silver platter. I checked my reflection in the ornate mirror hanging above the fireplace. I adjusted my posture, letting my shoulders slump just a fraction. I practiced a vacant, slightly lost expression, letting the hard, calculating edge vanish from my eyes. I was no longer the ruthless corporate titan who had spent the last 48 hours dismantling their entire financial existence with the federal government. I was merely a tired, vulnerable old man who was rapidly losing his grip on reality. I was the prey patiently waiting for the predators to step into the cage. At precisely 7 o'clock, the heavy brass knocker on the front door echoed through the quiet halls of the estate. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the artificial fog of feigned dementia settle over my features, and walked slowly toward the foyer. When I opened the door, Jason and Rachel were standing on the covered porch, shielding themselves from the Seattle rain under a large black umbrella. They were dressed impeccably, exuding the polished, arrogant aura of a young power couple on the verge of total victory. Jason wore a tailored charcoal suit that emphasized his aggressive confidence, while Rachel was draped in an elegant, understated designer dress that probably cost more than my warehouse workers earned in a month. Come in out of the cold," I said, my voice intentionally wavering, adopting a fragile, welcoming tone. Jason closed the umbrella and stepped over the threshold, pulling me into a firm, overly enthusiastic embrace. "It is so good to see you, Dad," he declared, patting my back with an aggressive rhythm. "Thank you so much for doing this. We know how stressful the bank delays have been for you." Rachel followed close behind, offering me a stiff, perfumed hug that barely disguised the absolute revulsion she held for me. As she pulled away, her eyes immediately darted past my shoulder, scanning the hallway and looking straight into the formal dining room. Even from the foyer, the bright white rectangle of the cashier check was highly visible against the dark mahogany. I watched her pupils dilate. She was practically vibrating with raw, unadulterated greed. Her breathing hitched, and a sharp, hungry smile flickered across her perfectly painted lips. She looked at that piece of paper exactly the way a starving animal looks at a fresh kill. She had no idea that the offshore accounts she planned to transfer that money into were currently frozen and being actively monitored by federal agents. She only saw her one-way ticket to the Cayman Islands. Jason placed a warm, heavy hand on my shoulder, guiding me gently toward the dining room, as if I were made of fragile glass. "How are you feeling tonight, Dad?" he asked, his voice dripping with a sickly sweet, manufactured concern. "You look a little tired. How is your memory doing today? Did you remember to take your evening medications?" I nodded slowly, letting my gaze drift aimlessly around the room before finally looking back at him. "I think so," I murmured, keeping my voice quiet and uncertain. "Actually, what day is it today, Jason? Is it Thursday? I thought the housekeeper was supposed to be here on Thursdays to prepare the roast." I rubbed my forehead, displaying a perfect pantomime of profound cognitive distress. "It is Friday," Dad Jason corrected gently, exchanging a rapid, victorious glance with Rachel over my shoulder. "Do not worry about a thing. We brought some wonderful appetizers from that Italian place you love downtown. We are going to take care of you tonight." I let my hands shake noticeably as I reached out to pull my chair out from the table. I sat down heavily, staring blankly at the crystal water glass. Through my peripheral vision, I watched the absolute hubris radiating from both of them. They truly believed they had won. They thought they had successfully manipulated the system, outsmarted the old man, and secured their respective fortunes. The sheer arrogance of their posture was almost comical. Rachel quickly took the seat directly across from the documents, her eyes repeatedly darting back to the printed numbers on the bank check. We spent the next 30 minutes eating the catered food in an atmosphere of suffocating, artificial politeness. I forced myself to chew slowly, occasionally dropping my fork with a loud clatter against the porcelain plate to maintain the illusion of failing motor skills. I purposefully repeated the same mundane questions about the weather, watching Jason patiently answer them, while giving Rachel subtle, knowing nods. They were absolutely reveling in my perceived mental decline. The appetizers were finally cleared away, leaving only the half-empty wine glasses on the table. The terrible tension in the room suddenly shifted, sharpening into a singular, focused point of anticipation. The moment had finally arrived. Jason reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his reading glasses, sliding them onto his face with a practiced air of solemn authority. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood, and deliberately pushed the stack of durable power of attorney documents and the medical proxy forms across the mahogany table. He slid the heavy fountain pen right next to the signature lines. The trap was ready to snap on his fingers. He looked at me with an expression of profound, calculated sympathy. "Just sign right here, Dad," he said, his voice soft and persuasive. "It is for your own good. We will take care of everything from now on." I picked up the heavy gold-plated fountain pen. The cold metal felt grounding against my skin. I let the polished tip hover just a fraction of an inch above the crisp white paper of the durable power of attorney. The silence in the dining room was absolute, broken only by the steady drum of the rain against the glass and the soft crackle of the fireplace. I could feel Jason and Rachel holding their breath. Their entire future, their stolen wealth, and their escape from ruin all rested on the small motion of my wrist. They leaned in, slightly drawn toward the document, like moths to a flame, their eyes wide with a hungry, desperate anticipation. I held the pen there for a long, agonizing moment. I let them savor the illusion of their imminent victory. I let them taste the absolute certainty that they had won. Then, moving with a calm, deliberate precision, I set the pen down flat on the mahogany table. It landed with a sharp, heavy click that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. My hand did not shake. The faint manufactured tremor I had maintained all evening vanished completely. I straightened my spine, pulling my shoulders back against the carved wood of my dining chair. The frail, stooped posture of a defeated old man evaporated into the ether. I rolled my neck, feeling the familiar hardened strength return to my muscles. I raised my head and looked directly at them. The artificial fog of feigned dementia dropped from my face, instantly replaced by a mask of cold, unyielding granite. I locked my eyes onto Jason, staring at him with a dead, predatory intensity that I normally reserved for corporate rivals I was about to systematically dismantle. The sudden, drastic shift in my demeanor hit the room like a physical shockwave. The air grew instantly thick and suffocating. Jason froze, his confident smile fracturing at the edges. Rachel went completely rigid in her chair, her manicured fingers tightening into white-knuckled fists around her wineglass. They could sense the danger, the abrupt change in the atmospheric pressure, but their arrogant minds were struggling to comprehend it. I let the terrible, heavy silence stretch between us, watching the initial flickers of confusion bloom in their eyes. "Before I sign away my life, Jason, I have a quick question," I said. My voice was no longer the wavering, uncertain whisper of an elderly man losing his mind. It was deep, resonant, and sharp as a razor, echoing with absolute authority. I watched Jason swallow hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as a bead of cold sweat formed at his hairline. He tried to force a patronizing smile, but his facial muscles betrayed him, twitching with sudden apprehension. "Of course, Dad," he managed to say, his voice strained and slightly breathless. "You can ask me absolutely anything. What is on your mind?" I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, and interlaced my fingers. "How is the employee pension fund doing?" I asked, keeping my tone deadly calm and conversational. Because when I reviewed the primary ledger, I noticed it is exactly $12 million lighter this quarter. The reaction was instantaneous and spectacular. All the blood drained entirely from the face of my son. He turned a sickly, translucent shade of pale white, resembling a man who had just stepped onto a hidden landmine. His jaw went slack, and the confident, patronizing facade he had worn for weeks shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Beside him, Rachel completely stopped breathing. I watched her chest freeze midway through an inhalation. Her eyes darted toward Jason, flashing with a sudden, uncontrolled terror. She was a master manipulator, but even she could not mask the sheer panic of having her darkest, most deeply buried secret casually dropped onto the dining room table. "Dad," Jason stammered, his voice cracking into a high, desperate pitch. He raised his hands, palms facing outward, as if he could physically push my words back into my mouth. "Dad, I have no idea what you are talking about. Your mind is slipping again. You are confused." He was terrified, scrambling blindly in the dark to find the familiar comfort of his primary lie. He was desperate to force me back into the neat, convenient box he had built for me. He looked over at Rachel, silently begging for backup, but she remained completely frozen, staring at me with a horrific, dawning realization. The offshore wealth manager, the Cayman Islands, the one-way ticket. It was all suddenly at risk, and her mind was racing to calculate the exact level of exposure she currently faced. "You have been under a lot of stress with the house and the bank," Jason continued, his words tumbling out in a frantic, disjointed rush. "You are mixing things up, Dad. The pension fund is perfectly fine. The market is just fluctuating, and you are not reading the reports correctly. We need to get you to Dr. Evans right away. This is exactly why we need the proxy signed. You are having an episode." His attempt to gaslight me was so utterly pathetic it almost made me laugh. He was staring down the barrel of total ruin, yet he still believed he could simply talk his way out of the execution. I did not raise my voice. I did not break eye contact. I let him babble, letting the sheer absurdity of his lies hang in the silent room. I waited until he finally ran out of breath, his chest heaving as he stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. I reached my right hand down into the empty space beneath the dining table. Before they arrived, I had securely taped a thick, heavy manila folder to the underside of the mahogany wood. My fingers found the adhesive edge. I gripped the thick cardboard and pulled it free with a sharp, tearing sound. I brought the folder up and dropped it squarely in the middle of the table, right on top of his fraudulent medical documents. I placed my palm flat against the manila cover and slowly, deliberately slid it across the polished surface. The folder stopped directly in front of Jason. I watched him stare at it, as if it were a highly explosive bomb. "I am not confused, son," I said, every single syllable dripping with absolute freezing venom. "But I am incredibly curious why you intentionally forged my physical signature to digitally wire that exact money directly to an untraceable offshore account." The air in the room grew completely stagnant. Jason stared at the folder, absolutely terrified. Rachel shifted her gaze from the folder to the cashier check, and then finally to my face. The absolute horror radiating from her eyes told me everything I needed to know. The trap was sprung. Jason did not reach for the manila folder. He stared at the thick cardboard as if it possessed a deadly radioactive core. The silence in the dining room stretched so thin it threatened to snap, filled only by the relentless drumming of the rain against the tall glass windows. For a fraction of a second, I saw genuine, unadulterated fear flash across his face. He knew his digital fortress had just been breached. But my son had always possessed a dangerous, volatile pride. Instead of crumbling under the weight of his undeniable guilt, his fear rapidly hardened into a desperate, cornered rage. He pushed himself away from the table so violently that his heavy wooden dining chair tipped backward and crashed loudly against the hardwood floor. He stood towering over the mahogany table, his chest heaving under his tailored suit. His face flushed a dark, mottled red, and a prominent vein throbbed furiously at his temple. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my face. "You cannot prove a single thing," he snarled, dropping the facade of the loving son entirely. His voice was a harsh, guttural bark that echoed off the high ceiling. "Your physical signature is on every one of those wire transfers. Your login credentials were used to bypass the security protocols. Your home network authorized the diversion of the employee pension funds. If you blow the whistle to the authorities, you are the one who goes straight to federal prison, old man." He slammed his palms back onto the edge of the table, leaning forward until his face was only inches from the center arrangement. "You are cornered. You have no move left to make. Sign the medical proxy and the durable power of attorney right now, or I will hand the forensic ledgers over to the FBI and let them take you down. I will let you rot in a federal cell for the rest of your pathetic life." I did not flinch. I did not blink. I simply sat perfectly still in my chair, absorbing the absolute vitriol pouring from his mouth. His threat hung heavily in the air, toxic and desperate. He truly believed he still held the winning hand. He believed his frame-up was entirely bulletproof, but his arrogant calculations were fundamentally flawed, primarily because he had failed to account for the secondary predator sitting right next to him. I slowly shifted my gaze away from his flushed, furious face and turned to look directly at my daughter-in-law. Rachel was sitting completely frozen, her eyes darting frantically between Jason and the manila folder. She was desperately trying to calculate her own exposure, wondering if she still had enough time to execute her escape. "Jason thinks he is blackmailing me," I said, my voice cutting through the thick tension like a surgical scalpel. I kept my tone incredibly conversational, almost light, ignoring my son entirely. I watched Rachel swallow hard, her throat visibly constricting. She gripped her linen napkin so tightly her knuckles turned completely white. "But Rachel," I continued, leaning slightly forward, "why do you not tell your wonderful husband all about your good friend Victor?" The name landed in the room with the force of a physical blow. Rachel completely stopped breathing. The faint, manufactured color in her cheeks vanished, leaving her face a stark, ghostly white. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound emerged. Jason blinked, his furious expression faltering, as a wave of deep, genuine confusion washed over his features. He turned his head slowly to look at his wife. "Victor," Jason repeated, his voice losing its aggressive edge, replaced by a sudden, uncertain hesitation. "Rachel, who is Victor? What is he talking about?" Rachel could not answer. Her jaw trembled and her eyes widened in absolute terror as she stared at me. She knew exactly what was coming, and she knew there was absolutely no escape. Without breaking eye contact with her, I reached into the interior pocket of my suit jacket. I pulled out a small encrypted digital audio player and placed it gently onto the table. I pressed the central play button. The recorded audio from her luxury vehicle immediately filled the silent dining room, playing through the high-definition speaker with devastating clarity. First, the ambient hum of the highway played, followed by the crisp sound of a Bluetooth connection. Then Rachel began to speak. Her voice echoed off the walls, laced with a breathless, passionate intimacy that Jason had likely not heard in years. The romantic banter with the offshore wealth manager played out for a few excruciating moments, establishing the undeniable reality of their affair. Jason stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, listening to his wife flirt with another man. But the affair was merely the prelude to the true devastation. The audio shifted, and Rachel delivered the fatal, calculating blow. "Once Jason gets the $1.5 million from the old man tomorrow," the recorded voice of my daughter-in-law declared, her tone dripping with sheer mockery and malicious joy, "I am transferring it straight into our offshore account in the Cayman Islands. I am leaving Jason holding the bag for the FBI and the cartel. He is entirely too stupid to realize I have been using him this entire time to drain his father's empire. He thinks we are running away together." The recording captured her cruel, echoing laughter before I reached out and pressed the stop button. The silence that rushed back into the room was absolutely deafening. The grand illusion they had maintained for years was completely and utterly pulverized. Jason slowly turned his head to look at his wife. The sheer horror radiating from his eyes was profound. The arrogant, untouchable mastermind who had just threatened to throw his father in a federal prison suddenly realized he was nothing more than a pathetic, disposable pawn. He had risked decades in prison, stolen millions, and borrowed money from violent cartel associates for a woman planning to steal his lifeline and leave him slaughtered. Rachel scrambled backward in her chair, pressing herself against the dining room wall. "It is a fake!" she screamed, her voice shrill and completely unhinged. She pointed a frantic, trembling finger at the audio player. "It is a lie. He used a computer program to fake my voice. Jason, you have to believe me. He is just trying to tear us apart." But Jason was not listening. The absolute truth of her betrayal had fundamentally broken his mind. He looked at her perfectly painted face, and then he looked down at the center of the mahogany table. He saw the power of attorney documents. He saw the manila folder containing the evidence of his massive fraud. And then his eyes locked onto the crisp white rectangle of the $1.5 million certified cashier check. It was his only remaining hope. It was the only thing standing between him and the ruthless Macau lending syndicate whose deadline was quickly approaching. He let out a primal guttural roar of pure desperation, threw his weight forward across the polished wood, and made a violent, frantic lunge for the money. His fingers slammed down onto the crisp paper, crumpling the edges as he ripped it toward his chest. He clutched the $1.5 million cashier check against his tailored suit, his chest heaving with erratic, ragged breaths. He looked like a wild animal backed into a corner, completely stripped of his corporate veneer and his arrogant composure. "You are crazy!" he screamed, his voice echoing sharply against the high ceiling of the dining room. "I am taking this money and I am leaving. You have lost your mind, old man. You are completely delusional." He backed away from the table, his eyes darting frantically around the room, as if expecting the walls to collapse inward. "I am going to the bank first thing in the morning, and then I am gone. You can rot in this massive empty house with your ridiculous conspiracy theories and your fake folders. I am done with you. I am done playing the dutiful son to a paranoid, ungrateful tyrant." He was projecting his own monumental guilt, desperately trying to construct a narrative where he was the victim of an aging father who had simply lost touch with reality. He stood there gripping the crumpled paper as if it were a physical shield against the devastating truth I had just dropped into the center of the room. He thought the paper in his hand was his salvation, his ticket out of the massive hole he had dug for himself. I watched his pathetic display of bravado without moving a single muscle. The silence stretched out heavy and suffocating, broken only by his ragged breathing. I slowly reached out, wrapping my fingers around the delicate stem of my crystal wine glass. I lifted it from the table, the deep red vintage catching the light of the overhead chandelier. I brought the glass to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip. The wine was rich and complex, a perfect contrast to the bitter synthetic taste of the poisoned coffee he had been feeding me for weeks. I lowered the glass and set it gently back onto the mahogany wood, letting the soft clink resonate through the room. A cold, genuine smile touched the corners of my mouth. I looked at him completely unbothered by his frantic shouting. "You always were in such a terrible rush, Jason," I said, my voice completely smooth, carrying the undeniable weight of absolute authority. "You never took the time to read the fine print." I folded my hands together and rested them on the table. "Look closely at the check, Jason. Look very closely at the payee line." His brow furrowed in deep, sudden confusion. The utter confidence in my voice pierced through his thick layer of panic. He slowly lowered his hands, holding the crumpled paper up to the light of the chandelier. I watched his eyes scan the printed text. I watched as the final devastating realization washed over his features. The last remaining drop of color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a polished corpse. He opened his mouth, but his vocal cords completely failed him. The check was not made out to Jason. It was not made out to Sterling Logistics, and it certainly was not made out to the offshore holding company he had meticulously set up in the Cayman Islands. The payee line was printed in bold, unmistakable black ink. It was made out directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation Restitution Fund. The $1.5 million was never meant to save him. It was the exact calculated down payment on my full federal immunity. It was the physical proof of my complete cooperation with the authorities. "You see, son," I continued, my words landing like heavy stones in the silent room. "You thought you could simply forge my signature, drain the pension accounts, and leave me holding the bag for your catastrophic failures. You thought you could outsmart the man who built an entire empire from absolute scratch. But you forgot one crucial detail. I did not get to the top of the corporate world by being trusting or soft. I built my empire by eating wolves exactly like you for breakfast." Jason began to tremble violently. The check slipped from his numb fingers and fluttered to the hardwood floor, landing completely ignored near his expensive leather shoes. His lips moved soundlessly as his brain short-circuited, unable to process the absolute magnitude of his defeat. But I was not finished. The financial devastation was merely the prelude to the true, ultimate betrayal. I reached into the interior pocket of my suit jacket and slowly pulled out the thick, neatly folded paper I had secured earlier that afternoon. I placed it onto the table right next to the manila folder and the useless medical proxy forms. I smoothed out the creases with deliberate care. I slid the final devastating piece of evidence across the polished mahogany until it stopped directly in front of him. "This is the expedited toxicology report from a highly secure private medical laboratory," I explained, watching his eyes lock onto the bright red chemical names highlighted on the page. "They tested the special imported organic coffee you have been so kindly brewing for me every single Sunday morning. The coffee you swore was going to protect my cardiovascular health." Jason staggered backward, hitting the wall behind him with a dull thud. His legs could barely support his weight. "You did not just commit massive corporate fraud, Jason," I said, my voice dropping to a freezing, venomous whisper. "You did not just embezzle $12 million from the hardworking people who built my company. You actively chemically tried to poison me. You systematically fed me a highly concentrated cocktail of central nervous system depressants and severe cognitive suppressants. You were slowly, methodically murdering my mind so that I would fail the dementia evaluation and rot in a psychiatric ward for the rest of my natural life." The sheer gravity of his horrific crime hung in the room, suffocating and absolute. Jason slid down the wall, collapsing onto the floor in a pathetic, broken heap. He buried his face in his trembling hands, letting out a hollow, agonizing sob. He finally understood that he had lost everything. His money, his career, his freedom, and his father were all permanently gone. Across the table, Rachel suddenly snapped out of her paralyzed state. The survival instinct of a cornered predator forcefully kicked in. She realized the game was entirely lost. The offshore accounts were completely compromised, and her brilliant master plan had spectacularly detonated. She did not look at her weeping husband. She bolted from her chair, her expensive heels clicking frantically against the hardwood floor as she sprinted toward the grand foyer. She reached the heavy oak front doors, grabbing the brass handles and throwing them wide open into the stormy night. She expected to see the dark, empty driveway and a clear path to her getaway vehicle. Instead, she was met by a blinding, overwhelming wall of flashing red and blue police lights. The end had finally arrived for both of them, destroying their entire lives. The heavy oak doors did not just open. They were aggressively breached. A flood of federal agents wearing dark tactical gear poured into the grand foyer, their boots thudding heavily against the imported marble floors. The blinding strobe of red and blue police lights cut through the driving rain, casting long, frantic shadows across the walls of my estate. Rachel let out a piercing, high-pitched scream and stumbled backward, her designer heels slipping on the polished wood as she desperately tried to retreat into the safety of the house. It was a futile, pathetic attempt to escape the inescapable. Special Agent Marcus Thorne stepped through the doorway, shaking the cold Seattle rain from his dark trench coat. His presence commanded absolute authority. He bypassed Rachel entirely, signaling 2 armed agents to secure her, and walked with determined, measured strides directly into the formal dining room. The room that had moments ago been the stage for the ultimate triumph of my son was now the ground zero of his catastrophic destruction. Marcus looked at the chaotic scene. He saw Jason crumpled on the floor, weeping uncontrollably. He saw the fraudulent medical proxy forms, the manila folder filled with evidence, and the toxicology report lying next to the $1.5 million cashier check made out directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Marcus turned his gaze to me and gave a single respectful nod. The trap had worked flawlessly. The perimeter was completely secure. There was absolutely nowhere left for them to run. Out in the foyer, the sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed sharply through the house. Rachel was violently resisting, twisting her arms and thrashing against the firm grip of the federal agents. The elegant, untouchable facade she had maintained for years completely shattered, revealing the ugly, desperate core of a cornered criminal. She shrieked, demanding to call her attorney, screaming that she was a victim, that she knew nothing about the embezzlement or the forged transfers. But Marcus had already frozen her offshore routing numbers and possessed the audio recording of her explicit confession. She realized her lies were utterly useless. Her panic rapidly morphed into a vicious, unhinged fury. As the agents forcefully marched her toward the front door, she turned her head and unleashed a torrent of absolute venom. She cursed her offshore wealth manager Victor for not transferring the funds fast enough. She cursed Jason, screaming that he was a pathetic, weak fool who had ruined her life and trapped her in his colossal failure. Finally, she locked her furious, tear-streaked eyes on me, her voice hoarse and ragged, as she cursed my name into the night. Her screams slowly faded into the heavy rain as they shoved her into the back of a waiting federal cruiser, slamming the heavy door shut and trapping her in the dark. The silence in the house briefly returned, thick and heavy, before being broken by the pathetic, ragged sound of my son. Jason was still on the dining room floor, his knees pressed against the hardwood. The reality of the flashing police lights and the presence of armed federal agents had finally shattered his intense psychological denial. He looked up at Marcus, watching the agent pull a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. The sheer terrifying permanence of the situation hit Jason like a physical blow. He did not try to run. He did not try to fight. Instead, he resorted to the only pathetic weapon he had left. He turned to me, his face slick with tears and sweat, his tailored suit wrinkled and stained. He scrambled across the floor on his hands and knees, reaching out to grab the hem of my trousers. "Dad, please," he sobbed, his voice breaking into a desperate, wretched wail. "You have to call them off. Tell them it is a misunderstanding. Tell them we can fix this internally. I will give everything back. I will sign whatever you want me to sign. Just please do not let them take me away." His fingers gripped my fabric tightly, trembling with absolute terror. I looked down at the man who had spent the last 5 weeks handing me cups of synthetic poison, smiling warmly, while he actively murdered my mind. He was weeping like a terrified child, begging for the very mercy he had so ruthlessly denied me. "I am your son," he pleaded, his chest heaving with violent, ragged gasps. "I am your own flesh and blood, Dad. You cannot do this to your own family. You cannot just throw my life away. You are supposed to protect me. Please, I am begging you, save me." I looked down at him, staring into his bloodshot, terrified eyes. I searched my own heart, looking for a single ounce of hesitation, a fleeting fragment of paternal grief, or a whisper of the unconditional love that had defined my life for 40 years. I found absolutely nothing. The space where my love for him used to reside was completely hollow, burned out, and cauterized by the horrific reality of his betrayal. I did not feel anger anymore. I did not feel sorrow. I felt the profound, chilling clarity of a man who had successfully removed a fatal tumor from his own body. I slowly reached down and firmly pried his trembling fingers away from my clothing, letting his hands drop back onto the cold floor. I looked at him, my expression entirely devoid of any pity or compassion. "You stopped being my son the exact day you decided to put poison in my cup to steal the life I built for you," I stated, my voice echoing with a calm, absolute finality. "You are not my blood. You are just a criminal who made a massive miscalculation." I stepped back, severing our connection permanently. Marcus stepped forward, grabbing Jason by the shoulders and hauling him roughly to his feet. Jason offered no further resistance. His spirit was completely broken. Marcus spun him around, forced his arms behind his back, and locked the steel handcuffs tightly around his wrists. The metallic clicking sound was the final punctuation mark on his entire corporate career. Jason was led away in total humiliating disgrace. He did not look back at me. His head hung low, his shoulders slumped in utter defeat, as Marcus guided him out through the grand foyer and into the stormy night. The heavy oak doors finally swung shut behind them, sealing out the harsh blue and red lights and the sound of the driving rain. The federal agents filed out quickly and efficiently, taking the evidence folders, the forged documents, and the cashier check with them. They left my estate exactly as they had found it. The profound silence of my home returned, wrapping around me like a heavy protective blanket. I stood alone in the formal dining room, the fire still burning warmly in the stone hearth. The devastating threat to my mind, my freedom, and my legacy had been flawlessly neutralized. My $80 million logistics empire remained entirely in my hands. The deadly, insidious cancer had been permanently cut out of my life. The first rays of dawn broke through the heavy gray cloud cover over Seattle, casting a cold, pale light across the dark waters of Puget Sound. I woke up much earlier than usual, rising from my bed, with a physical and mental clarity I had not experienced in over a month. The crushing synthetic fog that had clouded my brain was completely gone, washed away by a single night of clean hydration and the absolute removal of the chemical poison my son had been feeding me. I dressed in my sharpest, darkest tailored suit, tied a perfect Windsor knot, and walked out the front door. Greg was already waiting by the idling sedan. He did not ask how I slept or how I was feeling. He simply opened the heavy door, gave a firm, respectful nod, and drove me directly to the massive steel and glass headquarters of Sterling Logistics. When I walked through the sliding glass doors of the main lobby, the atmosphere was incredibly thick and undeniably tense. The rumors had already started to spread like wildfire through the corporate grapevine. Federal agents raiding the executive suites in the middle of the night, heavily armed officers seizing computer servers, and the sudden, unexplained disappearance of the chief operating officer tend to generate a specific kind of terrified whisper. The receptionists stopped typing. The security guards stood rigidly at attention. I bypassed the private executive elevators entirely and walked straight to the center of the main atrium floor. I instructed my head of human resources to immediately sound the General Assembly alarm. I wanted every single employee from the top floor vice presidents down to the ground floor janitors gathered in the central hall. I did not want to issue corporate memorandums or sanitized press releases. I wanted to look my people directly in the eyes. Within 20 minutes, a massive sea of anxious, expectant faces filled the atrium. The silence was absolute. I stepped up onto the slightly raised presentation dais, gripping the solid edges of the wooden podium. I looked out over the massive crowd, taking a long moment to recognize the immense responsibility I held for every single person standing in that room. I did not use corporate doublespeak or legal jargon. I spoke with brutal, unfiltered honesty. I told them that as of last night, Jason was permanently terminated from all administrative and operational positions within Sterling Logistics. I informed them that he was currently sitting in a federal holding cell awaiting a grand jury indictment for massive corporate fraud, embezzlement, and attempted murder. A collective gasp rippled through the hundreds of gathered employees, followed quickly by a shocked, murmuring undertone. I raised my hand, demanding absolute silence, and the enormous room instantly quieted down. I addressed the deepest, most profound fear that I knew was currently paralyzing the older veteran workers in the crowd. I told them that Jason had illegally accessed the highly restricted corporate financial framework and systematically drained exactly $12 million directly from the employee pension fund. I watched the blood drain from the faces of men and women who had dedicated their entire adult lives to my company. I saw the sudden, terrifying realization hit their eyes that their hard-earned retirement had been ruthlessly stolen by the spoiled, arrogant son of the founder. But before the mounting panic could fully set in, before a single person could raise their voice in protest or fear, I delivered the absolute certainty of my unwavering promise. I announced that early this morning I had instructed my personal wealth management team to completely liquidate a large portion of my private estate. I had transferred $12 million of my own personal liquid assets directly back into the company pension accounts. Every single stolen cent had already been fully restored. No employee would lose a dime. No hardworking family would suffer because of my son and his monumental reckless greed. The profound wave of relief that washed over the massive room was a physical, tangible force. Some people openly wept, while others let out heavy, shaking breaths of pure gratitude. I stood at the podium and looked out at the weathered faces of the dock workers, the forklift operators, the logistics coordinators, and the middle managers. I saw people who had been standing right beside me since the very beginning, 45 years ago, back when Sterling Logistics was just 3 leased delivery trucks and a damp, unheated warehouse near the industrial shipyard. We had sweated together on those freezing loading docks. We had worked grueling 70-hour weeks fighting tooth and nail against massive corporate conglomerates to successfully carve out our own space in the ruthless shipping industry. We built this $80 million empire together, brick by brick, root by root, contract by grueling contract. Looking at their tired, grateful faces, a profound, life-altering realization settled deeply into my bones. For years, I had blindly believed that my true legacy was tied entirely to my biological bloodline. I had forced Jason into a powerful leadership role simply because he carried my last name, completely ignoring his obvious incompetence and his fundamental lack of moral character. I had foolishly prioritized genetics over loyalty, and it had nearly cost me my life and the lives of everyone standing in this room. But standing there bathed in the bright morning light filtering through the atrium glass, I finally understood the undeniable truth. My legacy was not the treacherous boy who shared my DNA. My true legacy was the hundreds of dedicated men and women standing right in front of me. They were the ones who truly relied on me, and they were the ones who had actually earned the fruits of this massive empire. I called David Miller up to the front of the room. David was my oldest, most fiercely loyal warehouse manager. He had started working for me 30 years ago, physically loading heavy wooden pallets in the freezing rain. He knew every single nut and bolt of the global logistics industry, and he commanded the absolute respect of every worker in the building. As he stood nervously next to the podium wiping his rough, calloused hands on his slacks, I formally announced his immediate permanent promotion to Chief Operating Officer of Sterling Logistics. The entire atrium instantly erupted into deafening, spontaneous applause. Men and women cheered loudly, clapping David firmly on the back as the heavy, suffocating tension finally broke, replaced by an overwhelming sense of unity and renewed purpose. The massive company was completely safe. I left the crowded atrium to the continuous sound of cheering and took the private glass elevator all the way up to my executive suite. The room was perfectly silent. I walked slowly over to the mahogany credenza, poured myself a steaming cup of fresh black coffee, and turned on the large wall-mounted television. I stood silently and watched the local morning news broadcast Jason and Rachel being forcefully led into the federal courthouse in heavy iron handcuffs. I felt absolutely no sorrow, feeling only the immense, profound relief of a tired man who had finally survived a very long, highly deadly shipwreck. 6 months have passed since that dark storm swept Friday evening, and the crushing weight that once suffocated my life has completely lifted. I sit alone on the expansive cedar porch of my Medina estate, bathed in the gentle golden light of early morning. The crisp, salt-tinged breeze from Puget Sound washes over me, carrying the fresh scent of pine and open water. The world is quiet, peaceful, and profoundly still. I hold a heavy ceramic mug in my hands, feeling the comforting warmth radiating through my palms. I bring the rim to my lips and take a slow, deep sip of real, uncontaminated coffee. The rich, bold flavor is a daily revelation. There is no hidden bitterness, no synthetic chemical aftertaste, and no creeping fog clouding my mind. My thoughts are sharp, clear, and completely my own. The paralyzing lethargy and terrifying memory lapses that Jason so meticulously orchestrated are nothing more than fading nightmares. I am alive, my mind is completely intact, and my estate is safe. The fallout from that night in the formal dining room was swift, brutal, and entirely public. The federal government moved with a ruthless efficiency that left absolutely no room for negotiation or escape. The mountain of irrefutable evidence we handed over to the Bureau, the decrypted server logs, the forged wire transfers, the explicit audio recordings, and the damning toxicology report formed an ironclad cage around my son and his wife. Jason initially tried to fight the charges, clinging to a pathetic, desperate delusion that his expensive defense attorneys could manipulate the system. But when he finally comprehended the sheer magnitude of the federal indictment, his arrogance evaporated. Facing decades behind bars for embezzlement, corporate fraud, and the attempted murder of a primary federal witness, Jason folded. He took a miserable plea deal, accepting a sentence of 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. He traded his tailored suits for a coarse canvas uniform, his entire future erased by his own boundless greed. Rachel, true to her fundamentally treacherous nature, immediately turned on him. The moment the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, she frantically attempted to cut a deal offering to testify against her husband in exchange for immunity. She sat in federal interrogation rooms and painted Jason as a mastermind, weeping fabricated tears as she claimed she was merely a terrified bystander. But the audio recording of her cruel, calculated laughter while plotting to flee to the Cayman Islands proved otherwise. The prosecutors saw right through her venomous lies. Her desperate betrayal of Jason ultimately bought her nothing. She was convicted of massive financial conspiracy and federal fraud, receiving a harsh 10-year sentence of her own. The luxurious, sprawling condominium they had proudly paraded as a symbol of their success was immediately seized and foreclosed upon by the authorities. Every bank account was frozen, every asset was liquidated, and their entire lives were dismantled piece by piece. They were left with absolutely nothing, stripped of their wealth, their freedom, and their dignity. With the insidious cancer permanently removed from my life, I found myself standing at a profound crossroads. My $80 million logistics empire was secure, thriving under the capable, honest leadership of David Miller. For the first time in 40 years, I did not have to worry about corporate sabotage or treacherous family members plotting my demise in the shadows. But the massive wealth I had accumulated over a lifetime of grueling work suddenly felt incredibly hollow. I had originally built this empire to provide for my family, to ensure that my son would never know the desperate, grinding poverty of my own youth. I had handed Jason the world on a silver platter, shielding him from hardship and consequence, only to watch that unchecked privilege twist him into a monster, willing to poison his own father. I realized that merely hoarding this wealth was a disservice to the very legacy I had fought so hard to protect. I needed to ensure that my life work built futures rather than destroying them. I spent the next 3 months working closely with Thomas Mitchell to completely restructure my personal estate. I quietly diverted a massive portion of my liquid assets, establishing a comprehensive, independently managed trust fund entirely dedicated to supporting underprivileged youth across the greater Seattle area. We built scholarship programs for brilliant students trapped in failing school districts. We funded community centers, mentorship initiatives, and vocational training facilities for young men and women who possessed raw ambition but lacked the financial resources to escape their circumstances. I took the millions of dollars that Jason had tried to steal and weaponize against me, and I placed it directly into the hands of children who truly understood the value of hard work and gratitude. I attended the opening of our first vocational center last week, standing in the back of the room as I watched dozens of young adults enthusiastically learning the trades of the logistics industry. Looking at their bright, determined faces, I felt a profound sense of peace wash over me. My true legacy would not be defined by the biological son who betrayed me. My legacy would live on in the thousands of lives I could help elevate, in the genuine, honest futures I could help build from the ground up. I leaned back in my chair on the cedar porch, listening to the gentle rhythm of the waves lapping against the distant shoreline. The morning sun climbs higher into the gray sky, cutting through the lingering mist. I close my eyes, breathing in the clean, untainted air. The deep, agonizing wounds of betrayal have finally begun to heal, replaced by the quiet, steady strength of a man who has navigated the darkest storm and emerged entirely intact. I have survived the worst kind of deception, the kind that hides behind warm smiles and false affection. I am finally truly free. I watch a lone sailboat drift slowly across the wide horizon, entirely unburdened by the rushing tidal currents. Suddenly, The sharp, persistent buzzing of my cellular phone shatters the serene morning silence. The device vibrates against the glass top of the patio table. I slowly open my eyes and look down at the illuminated screen. The caller identification displays a generic unlisted number, followed immediately by an automated text alert indicating an incoming collect call from a federal correctional facility. It is Jason. He wants to speak to me. He wants to reach out from the bleak, terrifying reality of his concrete cell, perhaps to beg for forgiveness, perhaps to ask for money, or perhaps just to hear the voice of the father he threw away. I stare at his name flashing on the digital screen. I feel absolutely no anger, no sorrow, and no lingering obligation. I take a deep, steady breath of the crisp ocean air, savoring the absolute clarity of my mind and the profound safety of my estate. I reach out, place my finger on the smooth glass, and firmly press the red decline button. The screen goes completely dark, returning the world to perfect silence. Some doors must remain closed forever. The sun begins its slow descent over the Seattle skyline, casting long, brilliant streaks of gold and crimson across the rippling surface of Puget Sound. I sit quietly on my cedar porch, watching the light dance on the water. For so many years, I was completely terrified of dying alone. That deep, paralyzing fear had anchored me to a highly toxic illusion. I tolerated their endless arrogance and disrespect because I fundamentally believed that family was an unbreakable bond. I operated under the rigid assumption that biological connection was a mandatory obligation, regardless of exactly how much psychological and emotional abuse you suffered. I let them sit at my table, drink my wine, and spend my hard-earned money, willfully ignoring the subtle sneers and the whispered insults. I had convinced myself that their presence, however cold and mercenary, was somehow better than the quiet emptiness of a massive, silent house. But as the cool, salty ocean breeze hits my face tonight, bringing with it the sharp, undeniable clarity of survival, I realize how incredibly foolish I had been. True solitude is not being physically alone in a large house. True solitude is sitting at a lavish dining table surrounded by people who are secretly plotting your absolute demise. It is looking into the familiar eyes of the boy you raised and seeing only a ravenous, impatient predator, eagerly waiting for you to die. For weeks, I had allowed a manufactured chemical fog to dictate my daily reality because I was too desperate to keep my fragile family intact. I nearly sacrificed my entire existence on the deceptive altar of fatherhood. I survived because I finally chose to respect myself more than I feared their permanent absence. The moment I held that toxicology report in the sterile medical clinic, the illusion instantly shattered. I stopped being the compliant victim and remembered exactly who I was. I built my massive logistics empire with my own two hands, working grueling shifts in the freezing rain, negotiating ruthless contracts, and outsmarting corporate giants who actively wanted to crush me. I had survived in the brutal trenches of commerce by recognizing a lethal threat and neutralizing it without a single ounce of hesitation. I brought that exact same relentless energy into my own home. I saved my own life with my own mind, dismantling their intricate, poisonous web with flawless, methodical precision. Now the $80 million company is thriving under genuine leadership. The hard-working employees are protected, their pensions fully restored, and a new generation of underprivileged youth is building real futures because of the enormous wealth Jason tried to steal. I am 70 years old, a time when society fully expects a man to quietly fade into the background, surrendering his hard-earned power and accepting his inevitable physical decline. But sitting here on this peaceful evening, breathing in the clean air and watching the city lights flicker to life across the dark water, I feel an incredible surging vitality. I am absolutely not fading away. The heavy anchor of deep family betrayal has been permanently cut loose, freeing me to navigate the rest of my days with absolute unburdened purpose. I watch the steady waves roll toward the shoreline. The profound silence of the estate is a wonderful, well-deserved sanctuary. I have reclaimed the narrative of my own existence. I am no longer a stepping stone for greedy children. Today, I feel like my life has just truly begun. I sit here and reflect on the ultimate truth of my long journey. My mind is sharp, my body is healing, and my spirit is completely unbreakable. The fortune I accumulated will never again be used to fund disrespect or silent cruelty. I survived the darkest betrayal imaginable by remembering my own unyielding strength. I am finally, completely, and unconditionally free from their toxic grasp. The future is entirely my own. Blood makes you related, but loyalty, respect, and gratitude are what truly make you family. We often sacrifice our own peace and safety to protect the people we love, blinding ourselves to their toxic behaviors. Never let the title of son, daughter, or family become a free pass for abuse or manipulation. Your life, your wealth, and your dignity are the results of your own hard work. You owe absolutely nothing to those who view you merely as an opportunity to be exploited. Always set firm, ironclad boundaries. Sometimes the most profound act of loving yourself is walking completely away. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and kindly subscribe to the channel. Have you ever had to permanently cut ties with a toxic family member to protect your own peace? Share your personal experiences in the comments below. See you in the next life story.